welcome to season 2 of Hashrocket Book Club. We left the last season on a cliffhanger, and then we killed off Lark over the break. So now I'm hosting it. I'm Cameron Daigle. I'm a resident designer here as well as front-end developer. And so even though we're a Rails shop, we're doing another JavaScript book because that's how we roll. And here, I want this to be more collaborative than old book club because I don't know if I'm permanent book club host ever. So, hand to the.
I'm Shane. I'm one of the front end developers. I get classified as a designer, but I do most of the front end development here. So this to me is what we should cover more often.
And you guys can just wave.
Yeah,
there you go.
We are the couch.
Alright. Okay, so we're going over the first 2 chapters of JavaScript patterns today. It's going to be mostly, for anyone familiar with JavaScript, it's hopefully not going to be too much of the same, but I think that he does a good job skipping over super basics and hitting some essential parts about why JavaScript patterns are it's necessary to come up with some JavaScript patterns that are different than other programming language, other established patterns. So I also had highlights in here, and then preview crashed on me, and then I made new highlights. So we'll see where the overlap is. So I think that he starts out with this section on why it's important to identify patterns, which is just basic setup stuff. But I thought this was a good line. Putting a label on some coding technique or approach makes it easier to make sure that we're talking about the same thing. For example, it's easier to say, I think, immediate function than this thing where you wrap the function in parentheses and at the end you put another set of parentheses to invoke the function right where you've defined it, which right away is a nice JavaScript-specific issue to have with the closure and the anonymous function and immediate calling and all that. Heretofore known as immediate function, I guess. Even though I honestly think that maybe there's going to be more of this in the book, but I didn't feel like there were that many useful terms that he's invented so far.
It doesn't apply specifically to JavaScript, but you normally see truthy and falsy used a lot in some beginning JavaScript stuff.
Yeah.
To sort of explain the difference between a double equals and triple equals.
Yeah, an actual false and then like an undefined null or all the other.
Empty string equal to 0.
Or an integer of 0. Yeah. So let's see, blah blah blah. This book discusses designing, coding, and anti-patterns. That's all set up. So JavaScript concepts. He actually opens by talking about JavaScript being an object-oriented language, which, I mean, you also hear JavaScript talked a lot about being a function-oriented language, but functions are objects. So I mean, I guess this is a more technically accurate way to describe JavaScript.
Prototypical.
It is prototypical. It is also a prototype. So it's an object-oriented, function-oriented prototypical language for anyone keeping score out there. So there's no classes in JavaScript. This is all, again, stuff that anyone familiar with JavaScript is going to recognize. One of the general rules in this Gang of 4 book that he references a few times, it's a standards book from the 90s involving some other languages. It says prefer object composition to class inheritance. So instead of I guess imposing an arbitrary inheritance structure onto an app when you might not need it, create objects out of available pieces you have lying around. And the nice thing about JavaScript is that's what you have to do because you don't have a choice because that's how JavaScript works. You don't have class inheritance. So piece of cake, right? So prototypes is the one function of JavaScript, or are the one function. Prototypes is prototypes. They're the one function of JavaScript that does involve inheritance. Do involve inheritance. Oh God.
Yeah. So an object prototype actually inherits from, a newly created object prototype inherits from the object prototype. And the DOM elements, as far as JavaScript's concerned, are also inheriting the object prototype.
So the important thing to discuss that he says here is that a prototype is still just an object. It's still not technically a class, and it's again just JavaScript's objects all the way down. So he talks a little bit about ECMA script here and strict mode, which is the version 5 feature, which removes features from the language, making programs simpler and less error prone. So a lot of the weirder stuff in JavaScript that a lot of people don't like, script mode disables, like the with statement is the one that he talks about. However, he says that every example in this book works in strict mode, but I have here a little table of, this is probably going to be too small for the camera, a little table of what actually supports strict mode, and the only things that currently supported are Firefox 4 and the WebKit nightlies. So it's not too big a deal right now. It seems like JSLint is still a little bit more of a practical way to check your JavaScript and make sure that it's compliant across browsers.
Why is ustrict a string there? Is that how it works?
Yeah, apparently it's recognized by browsers that support strict mode, and to other browsers it's just a string not assigned to a variable. So another awesome and weird thing with JavaScript is you can just use strict.
What he doesn't get into is whether or not, if you take that plain string, instead of using it within a function scope, if you just use it out in the global namespace, like, does that set all scripts that run on that page from that point on in strict mode, or does it have to be blocked?
It says once per scope, I guess, so...
Well, so you can do it once per scope, but can you do it globally?
Does it bleed down?
Yeah,
he doesn't mention
I don't
it.
think he goes into it at all in the book. I mean, I haven't finished the book yet, but something to look up if you're interested in ECMA script 5.
I honestly think he's mostly just future-proofing himself here in case strict mode does become the new or much more common. Then, you know, all of his examples still work in a future, cleaner, less insane JavaScript. So we'll see. He says it's a transitional version, which means that it's going to not be done for years, probably, given how transitional versions tend to work with front-end stuff.
Yeah, you'll note that ECMA script is currently on version 2.6 or something like
Yeah,
that.
and how
they're
long are
working
you
on
putting-
version 5?
And
So,
you know, how long were you putting transitional doc types in for years and years? So yeah. Moving on to where I've been kind of busting through some of this early stuff because it's just the introduction. So we're looking at page 6 now. A little bit about JSLint. It's just it's a compile time checker for good JavaScript practices. It's fairly picky. I really enjoy it. Some people might have a problem with it if they don't like making very traditional looking JavaScript, because JSLint expects semicolons, and pickier settings in it actually don't allow things like I++ to, and that I don't know if that's a default, because
According to the next chapter, it is a default.
Okay, because I actually am using, as one of the lone non-Vim users here, there's a pretty good JSLint plugin for TextMate that just runs a checker every time you save, and it just pops it up in a tooltip, which is really nice. But that one, at least the one I'm using, doesn't care if you use ++. So
I've heard some rumblings amongst JavaScripty people now that they don't feel JSLint's an appropriate tool anymore now with the Google closure out. Any thoughts on that, JavaScripty guys?
I've never really used JSLint to begin with. I think if you do what we're doing here and learn it the right way before you get too set in your ways, you're going to learn a pattern that JSLint is trying to coerce you into.
yeah, JSLint doesn't really care too much about patterns. The only pattern that it occasionally freaks out about is if it thinks that a function, I believe it thinks that a function isn't returning anything. There's a situation where you could have a return in a conditional and then more code, and it thinks that you might not be able to get to that other code. But that's about the only coding pattern thing that I use it for. Honestly, mostly it's just good for syntax checking, because it's really annoying if you've missed like one little thing, like a parentheses somewhere, and then you have to look in the, JavaScript's not really great about telling you where that is. So I mean, this book is way more useful for writing good JavaScript patterns than JSLint is.
Yeah, one of the, I don't know in the TextMate bundle, but one of the defaults set in JSLint is to always use strict equals. And that's another thing where I think if you learn how truthy and falsy values work, you can use that to your advantage in your conditionals instead of just constantly throwing a triple equals in there. So instead of checking, is this string triple equals empty string, you can just throw if this string in a condition, and if it returns falsy, then
Right.
you got to make sure that nothing outside of your program is able to access the variable, of course, but if you know that's the case, then I don't see why you can't do something like that.
And moving on, the console, console is the console. If you're using alerts instead of the console, then use the console. Firebug is pretty good. I like the Chrome console fine. Safari console is also very console-y. And that is the introduction. Great. So now that we all know how to use the console. Essentials, chapter 2. So he actually starts out very broadly here and then hits some specific bad parts of JavaScript pretty quickly, which I think is nice. The number one best, he gives all sorts of reasons for writing maintainable code and why this book is important. He spends a lot of time justifying this book, but I think it's really important. At Hashrocket, through the benefits of pairing, good Ruby technique has sort of organically formed, but JavaScript, because there's two of us doing it and then there's a bunch of other developers doing it, and sometimes we don't overlap and there's not a lot of pairing happening on JavaScript. That's why we're doing this, is hopefully that you people out there and us people in here will start writing JavaScript that is more maintainable. So he says the specific to bigger projects or companies, which I don't think is true at all, because the person who eventually fixes the bug is not the same person who created the bug, and also not the same person who found the bug. Maybe, but as soon as you have more than one person working on JavaScript, you're going to run into this kind of situation. I don't think it's specific to bigger projects or companies at all. It's specific to any company that realizes that it might be smart to have two people who know JavaScript on their staff instead of one. So, I made Tim Pope laugh. Also, maintainable code, more and more justification for writing maintainable code. Maintainable code means the code that looks as if it was written by the same person. I think this is by far the most strict bullet point on here, because there's a big difference between writing readable code that someone else will understand what's happening and readable code where they aren't like, oh, this is Robert's code. I know Robert always does this weird thing, so
Robert
I'm used to
throws his
it.
variables throughout the function
Yeah.
block willy-nilly, or something like that.
Yeah,
Not
so
saying you do, but
yeah.
I'm going to from now on.
You're a fictional hypothetical example until you make that a concrete fact. So don't, I guess. So it looks as if it was written by the same person. So I think writing code that is readable is one level, and being able to write code that reads as if your team was writing it is like a whole nother level.
What if your team's crappy?
If your team is crappy, I can't help you. That's outside the scope of this book club, sir.
You can be a beacon of not crappy in your team.
You can be a beacon of, and this is all about being
and in
a
a month or
beacon.
two, you'll probably leave for a more progressive company.
Great.
Oh, you guys.
Good on you.
Be a beacon of not crappy for your team.
Yes.
But I thought I was supposed to write code that looked like the rest of my team.
You are. Wait.
Well,
Oh.
I think he goes a bit further into it. I think it's further up from where you highlighted, but he basically says, if you're reading this, you probably should be an evangelist for your development team with regards to the way you pattern your JavaScript.
Yeah.
So he was ready for my bullshit ahead of time.
Yeah.
Damn
Always.
it.
Yeah, because JavaScript is definitely one of the most malleable forms, because as you're developing an application, and we all know this here, and I'm sure that anyone out there who's worked on a large enough project knows that JavaScript is the one thing that you may not be aware of immediately, like the scope of the JavaScript that might have to happen. And so you end up with sections of JavaScript that are just DOM manipulation. You end up halfway through the project wanting to maybe Ajax load this one section, and then you've got to switch a bunch of events to make them live instead of, or a bunch of jQuery events to be live instead of static. And JavaScript can change all the time, constantly, and so patterns are crucial to make sure that the JavaScript is maintainable over a long period of time. So let's get into some of the standard JavaScript don'ts which he hits a lot of them real quickly here. And the first one out of the gate is always, in every JavaScript book, minimizing globals. Because if you just write a variable without the word var in front of it, it's a global, and you don't want to do that.
Well, it's an implied global, I think.
It is an implied global. Well, he gets to exactly what it is.
Okay.
And that's my payoff, don't.
It's accessible globally.
It is. It's
Yes.
accessible globally. It is modifiable globally. It is a big problem.
Yeah.
Actually, funny story. Managed to screw with the JavaScript on a trophy e-commerce site last week, and because all of their variables were global, I was able to validate a order form that involved me ordering a trophy that was a base, a stand, a cup, and then another cup on top of the first cup. Fingers crossed. It arrived. I shipped it straight to my friend, and I haven't heard from him yet, so I'm really hoping my double cup trophy got there okay. But that's why you shouldn't use global variables, because someone who knows JavaScript could screw up your custom trophy ordering
You
system.
can totally set the price to 1 penny.
Yeah.
Or you could do that shit on the server side, like a
2 cups, 1 global.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steven. Well, it's only uphill from here, folks. Thanks. So, I mean, the problem with globals, he spends so long talking about this. The problem with globals is that they're global, and that, you know, your app might involve multiple plugins that might use the same variable name. I mean, you can screw up all sorts of stuff by just not putting the var on the front. For example, you know, here's a basic one. Result equals x plus y. You didn't declare result as a variable. Something else is probably using result. It goes to the global namespace. So put var in front of it. I won't spend forever on this. This is a slightly trickier one. Var a equals b equals 0. B is actually a global in this situation because JavaScript puts this equation together right to left. So it first looks at b equals 0 and decides, oh, b is global, and then it sets a equal to the global of b. So don't do that either.
I think it's worth noting right there in the middle of the screen, function foo var a comma b. That's totally cool.
Yes.
Those are not global.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
don't like to
but-
see those one per line, but
Yeah, he talks about a better way to declare your
Well,
variables. It's a little more
right.
readable.
By cool, I mean they're not global. Like b.
Yes, they are not global. This still isn't the best way to do it, but a comma b on the same line, not global. Side effects when forgetting var, which is basically what he was already talking about. So this is the deal. Implied globals are not variables at all. They're implied properties of the global object. So they're not even variables. You're just attaching things unwittingly to the global object of JavaScript,
which is window.
which is window. So you can actually delete global things, but you can't delete a variable. So, you know, that's also real bad, because you could delete other people's unwitting globals and just get yourself in all sorts of trouble. But I think that's an interesting point to make, is when you accidentally declare a global variable, you're not even really declaring a variable at all. You're declaring a property on the global object. So he has some examples of deleting that stuff. Just believe him and don't do that. So you can actually get to the global object, which is, I think, is kind of a weird thing to put in here. He just sort of says, by the way, you can get to the global object if you want to.
So you can delete those global methods you accidentally added.
Yeah, exactly. So
Or
you
global
can do
variables.
it, but you can't do it in strict mode. So my favorite part about that is that he talks about all of his code samples working in strict mode, and then he gives you a code sample and tells you that it doesn't work in strict mode. So that's cool. So here's the single variable pattern. Shane and I have talked about this one a lot because I don't feel like it's super necessary to do this, but it's really section 1/2 dozen to the other. The important principle is that you're declaring all your variables at the top of whatever scope they're working in. So this is the single var pattern. You have a variable, then you have all of your variables with a comma at the end of the line and then indented. Preferably also given a value. He talks about that in the next paragraph and actually has a couple here without values. But generally speaking, you should try to always initialize a value with it. You're looking at me with a concerned face.
Brings back memories of C. So
What this?
you have to do that in C.
Oh, you have to declare a value.
Is that why you
Upfront.
changed it back to individual var statements on a previous project? Just because it's a bad reminder?
Did I do that?
Yeah. I
Scars.
I
remember.
probably just didn't like you.
Ah, it's terrible.
No, I don't know. I don't remember that. But I don't know. It gives me a creepy feeling.
I think it's easier to scan through a function and say, okay, this block up to this point is all of the variable initialization. And the next line after that that's outdented is the actual code that's being run in the function.
Yeah, and on the other side, I mean, the reason that this bothers me is just that if you overlook putting a semicolon on one of these lines, JSLint ain't gonna care. Like, say you put a equals 1, then b equals 2, semicolon, then sum equals a plus b in my object. All the rest of these are suddenly global, but there's nothing in the program to warn you of that. So while you obviously just should be careful and not do that if you choose to use this pattern, another way is to just put var at the beginning of each of these lines, and then you've avoided that one possible misstep. It's a safer, perhaps slightly less stylish way to do it, but it's safer.
So what is the benefit of doing this?
Benefit of doing this is really
That you
to
don't have to
force.
say var every time?
Well, that's the weird thing. These are his logical reasons to do it. Provide a single place to look for all local variables, which you should be doing anyway, even if you put var at the beginning of each line. Prevents logical errors when a variable that's used before it's behind. That's the same thing as the first. Really, it's the first. Oh wait. Oh, he's going to talk about that in a minute. There's actually a way, if you are declaring a variable later, that actually initializes it at front. We'll talk about that in a minute. Helps you to remember declared variables and therefore minimize globals, which is the same thing as the first bullet point. And is less code to type and transfer over the wire, which is the weirdest possible justification, because a spacebar is still data that has to be transferred over the wire.
I
So.
think he's
But you're
talking.
forgetting the part where he runs it through a code compressor to save
Yes,
your
Right.
space
if
bars.
you minify it and you were working like
Doesn't minifying it do that anyway?
Yes.
Doesn't gzipping compress all that down to nothing anyway?
yes, it's the
Gzipping
silliest.
and
I mean,
minifying?
if you were transferring your code over a 14.4 modem or something, then you care whether the word var is in there or not. But realistically, it's not really a memory issue, because you're gzipping anything if you're worried about that much performance. So I don't think any of his justification is unique to using just one var, and I personally feel like it's safer to just put var at the beginning of each line and just put them all up there at the top. The important thing, regardless of which way you choose to do it, is that all of your variables are declared at the top of the block that they're being used in. You're shaking your head.
Yeah, we're gonna have to agree to disagree. I don't like it.
Which don't you like?
Putting them all at the top.
Oh, why don't you like putting them all at the top?
It's dumb.
Why is it dumb?
Because
Justify
now,
yourself, sir.
now I have to go back to the beginning of this function, which, because it's JavaScript, is probably going to be a few pages long.
No, see, that's
Well, that's where
Yeah.
you might be doing it wrong.
Yeah, I know, you should be extracting methods. And,
yeah. Your function
and
should
whatnot.
never be. that
In which
long.
case,
Why do you have so many variables
Yeah,
then
that's-
if you're extracting
that's
methods?
why I have so many variables.
He actually gives a great counterexample to this just a little bit later when he declares a var inside a for loop. It's like you can move it up, but now when you copy and paste the for loop around, shit gets all.
Oh yeah, yeah. We'll
Open
look at
yourself
that.
up to that possibility again.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes it makes sense to cluster the variable declaration with where it's used.
When it's like a teeny iterative variable, like the one in the for loop, that's definitely a case. I think that there's definitely a case for putting it either in the formal scope or the block that it's being used, or just putting it within the logical area that it's being used. Like maybe you have an if statement and then you declare a variable at the top of the if statement because it's just being used in there. I mean, I've definitely done that. Look, just don't make global variables. That's all he's trying to do here. Just keep you from making global variables. And if
That I
your
agree.
function is so long that you are annoyed with all your variables being declared at the top because you are scrolled to another page, your function is too long.
Or you need a bigger monitor.
Or you need a bigger
Yeah,
monitor.
there you go.
Zoom out. There's your solution for everything.
High resolution.
So hoisting. So this is that second bullet point that I was talking about. This is a weird thing that JavaScript does where here's the anti-pattern. You have a function, you access a variable, then you declare it as a var, even though that the variable might be declared outside of here first. like in this case is a global variable. It doesn't have to be. It could be something that would be normally be accessible within a function. Because you've declared another var here, this variable is actually initialized at the beginning of the function, whether it's defined or not. So all of a sudden, anything that accesses that is actually undefined prior to it. So here's another good reason to declare your variables first. Because in a situation where you're redeclaring a variable, you've got this weird dead space before you actually redefine it, because this JavaScript looks for this var first and initializes it here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's like
everyone.
if the first line of that function said var my name, and then you had alert my name, and then you set my name equal to local, that's essentially what the parser is doing.
Yeah, it moves the var declaration first, and then before the assignment or before anything else is happening. So, I mean, that's another possible hang-up that you could run into if you start putting var declarations in the middle of your function.
That's why I put all my vars at the end. It moves them up.
Do we have any comments on the site thing? Does that looks like
About
you're done.
unit testing.
Okay.
I mentioned that the two of us have used QUnit.
Yeah.
Primarily because we're writing jQuery plugins.
Yeah, QUnit's pretty cool.
Even if you're not writing jQuery.
Yeah, Laura mentioned that Jasmine is another option. Wants to know why we haven't tried it yet.
I don't know, I haven't had a use case for unit testing in a little while. The last one I did was the table sorter, and that was QUnit.
Yeah.
It worked great.
I haven't
Testing in a while.
I haven't written anything that
Busy designing things.
I wanted to use some sort of test suite on, so I haven't looked into Jasmine yet. The next plugin or something of that nature that I write that requires testing, I'll look into it.
And we usually use Selenium.
Yeah, you guys.
all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, sometimes we want to make our JavaScript available outside of.
Well, if you're writing a plugin, that's a
Yeah.
different thing.
Yeah, yeah.
But most of the JavaScript we write is not
You're doing
plugin.
manipulation.
Application code.
Indeed. Great. Now I lost my place. All right, so we're on page 15. He's explaining the thing that we just explained about the var situation. So here's the for loop thing that Tim was talking about. So in a situation where the thing that you're iterating over, the length that you're iterating over, like the length of an array, it's having to parse the array every single time you run through the loop, which is just like a little bit sloppy. Especially if it's if you're in jQuery and you're going through. Although, does jQuery handle this? If it's jQuery each probably takes care of it for
You
you.
pass the array in, so that's all kind of taken out of your hands.
Right. I think.
Probably the same thing goes here for if you're going through.
Well,
Alright.
are you talking about using jQuery to iterate over a vanilla array or
Either really.
an array of jQuery?
Because it's pretty common to not use a for loop if you're iterating in jQuery.
If you're using the each method in jQuery to iterate over an array, I think depending on the size of the arrays, it's going to be slightly more time to complete the iterations in the each method than writing a for loop like this, where you access the length
I
property.
guess that's true. It's going to be more abstracted out.
Well,
So-
it's a method.
How big is this array you're iterating over? Does this even matter?
Well, that's the thing. If it's a large enough size, you'll see a difference. But in
Yeah.
most cases, there's not going to be much performance difference between writing it this way, caching the length in a local variable, or using the each method in jQuery. You're not going to see a difference. And even if you benchmark it, it's going to be such varying results between
Yeah.
each run that.
Well, there's definitely two types of patterns in this book. I think there's performance-oriented patterns and readability, coding-oriented patterns. And occasionally stuff like this is much more concerned with performance than it is with, although you could argue too that he's just trying to give you build good habits. So, I mean, this is not technically the best habit to have, even though you're not going to run into a lot of cases where this performance gets in your way. You could also do this, which is what they're talking about. He's talking about here. This so what he's doing here is declaring a var of max, and then walking through max instead of walking through the array link.
But shouldn't this be the top of the function?
Well, here's the thing. I like this.
He goes into that a little bit later
He
on.
totally does, because this, and I think this one is pretty subjective. Shane likes this one. I think it looks kind of weird.
You can pick up
And
that.
I'll tell you why it looks weird to me is because I used to do some action script like action script 1 or 2, and in action script a for loop, each of these was a comma, I believe, instead of a semicolon.
That's weird.
I don't. It's been 10 years since
Yeah.
I've used it, but I don't remember.
Either that or that was just something that I tended to do,
Did-
screw up and not be able to find back when I was
I
doing
mean,
action
this
script.
is the C syntax, isn't it?
Yes,
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the
since
same.
every for loop I've ever seen is used semicolon.
Okay.
So that
Like-
would surprise me.
Well, I could be totally wrong. I know that it was a thing that I used to accidentally do, like when I was doing action script 1 or 2. So, anyway, I have skeletons in the closet that is causing me not to like this line, basically. So he's also like, oh, you could do it this way, like I told you earlier in the book, where you declare these up here. I think that this is fine. His reasons for not doing this is portability. Like if you decide to refactor and move this for loop somewhere else, you've got to make sure to also move the variable declaration that you're using when you do it. So maybe it's less portable. I also think that his choice of variable names here is kind of silly. Like you could also just name this variable something a little bit more descriptive, and that would help you in the reading process.
You could use that portability argument for not ever declaring stuff at the top, ever, because declaring a variable right before the small section where you're actually using it means that they're all together, so you can move that out, extract method, it's all right there.
Well, except for except for some examples like the ones you said earlier about if you start declaring variables here, then they're weirdly undefined up here. So
Well, why are you using them before you declare them?
well, if you're inheriting a variable from somewhere else.
Yeah,
or-
if you're,
But you're redefining it.
well, in that previous example, with variable hoisting, you're assuming that you have access to the global
yeah.
property of whatever that name is.
Why would
when-
you assume something is wrong?
Well, that's-
Shouldn't that be evidenced by your test suite
Hopefully.
when it fails?
And the real argument is, you shouldn't be using the freaking, assuming you can get to the global anyway. Whoever tries to get to the global.
Well, it doesn't have to be the global. It just has to be something that's declared outside of that block that would normally be accessible.
Yeah, if you've got a function expression in here with your variable declarations, you're going to assume that you have access to all of these variables within that expression.
And again, it's readability, and I think that readability, the readability and portability are kind of at odds. I think I'm always going to fall on the side of readability. Like if it takes me 1 extra second to be like, oh, I also have to move this one variable when I'm moving this loop, fine. Yeah, like that's. I would rather see something and be able to understand what it does immediately, and then if it takes me a ½ second extra to move it.
How?
What?
I just don't see how having a list of variables at the top of your function helps you understand or read that function or anything.
Well, especially with DOM manipulation, it helps you see because in DOM manipulation, say you're working through I guess in Mulu we have a thing where there's a drop down. You start typing it, autofills a drop down thing. You hit enter and it adds it to your list of chosen things. So you're dealing with here's a box of results, or a pool I think is what it's called, and here's a box where it's going to go. You want to set all that stuff up here, especially because some jQuery. Finding those elements in jQuery can be this like annoyingly long line. So you're immediately saying, here's my pool, this is how I get to it. Here's my this is how I get to it. So I think in cases of DOM manipulation in jQuery, getting all that stuff out of the way immediately is really helpful.
Yeah, then you know which DOM elements you have cached,
Yeah.
so that if you add anything to that particular block, you don't have to look that up again.
So here's my table, here's my pool, here's my results pool, and that way all that stuff is out of the way, and you don't have any You don't have any DOM walking, cluttering up the rest of your.
That was close.
Yeah, that was close. Cluttering up the rest of your code. What's the MPA rating on this?
I think glittering is okay.
Okay.
Someone is making Clitter.com right now.
Don't do that. Or at least credit us if you do that. Jeez. So yeah, there we go. Now that we're all in agreement,
Yeah.
this is what the book says. I appreciate his motivations for doing so. Again, it's all about readability.
What about if you have variables that you may or may not use conditionally? Should you still declare and cache all those objects for no reason at the top of the
He
function?
says to do that. I don't normally. I mean,
Huh?
so with conditional blocks, it's not a fully, enclosed block where you have local scope. If you declare a variable in a conditional, it's like you declared it at the top of the function block. But to me, it makes more sense seeing that in the conditional and thinking, oh well, I'm only instantiating it if this condition exists. Technically, it's being instantiated no matter what, but
There's also not a lot of cases of that. Like if you have a conditional, then maybe your variable should, you should use the same variable name for whichever condition it is. I mean, it depends. I guess you'd have to come up with a specific case where you'd only be using a certain variable in one condition and not the other.
Well, just 'cause you were saying you'll capture the DOM element at the top.
Mm-hmm.
That DOM element that you actually want to capture could be different based on that
Yeah, but
condition.
the variable could be the same.
Right, but
yeah, it could be the same, but the name that you've given the variable might be a misnomer depending on what you're putting into it.
Right. Well, maybe, that could be a variable naming issue and not I don't know. We'd have to have a specific example. But yeah, I mean, there's a certain amount of common sense, practicality involved here, where if there is a variable that's absolutely only being used in one condition, then maybe you just declare it within that condition.
so now that we're on.
Yes. Now that
Yes.
all the creases are ironed out. Page.
Now we're gonna make all this move by pointing out you only need one variable if you just go in reverse.
Oh yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. He's going to do that. One second. I got
That
it.
was adorable.
It was cute as hell, but on page 17, we'll get there. This is an option in jQuery or JSLint to not like plus plus and minus minus. Like I said, the TextMate bundle defaults to not caring whether you use plus plus or minus minus. I don't think excessive trickiness by itself is a good enough reason to not use it, which is what JSLint apparently says. Especially in a for loop. I mean, everyone, if you've programmed in any language ever with any for loop, you're used to seeing it end in a plus plus or minus minus, so do what you want.
So you only agree with his pattern sometimes. When
Well,
they see
he doesn't even say that this is his pattern. He just says that JSLint says you to do it, and then he says that you should do it, and then he says if you do disagree with it, just turn that alert off.
Okay.
So yeah, he don't care. Later in the book, he does use the I plus equals 1 pattern. So that's tiny. I think there are bigger fish for us to fry in this book club. So here's his, and he does say these are micro optimizations. Here are some micro optimizations that are they are here. So you just count down to 0.
Yeah, so instead of caching the array length in a second variable
Right.
and having your iterator variable in the length,
So
it
they'll-
sets the iterators of the length and then counts down.
So if
So
you
if
were,
you're doing something that counts in the order of the array, though, then that's gonna.
oh no, yeah, obviously you can't use this in a lot of situations. And it's only noticed in performance critical operations. So if you're benchmarking something by milliseconds, then maybe you care. But if you don't want to make your other programmers' heads explode, you should
I would
probably not.
consider that to be excessive trickiness.
Yeah, I would as well,
Warning against.
for sure. This goes back to that whole, well, I guess it's performance versus readability thing, instead of portability versus readability. But the point is, this is less readable.
When was this book written?
Huh?
When was this book written?
Last year?
Just with a big emphasis on JavaScript performance. I mean,
JavaScript people really like performance. It's true.
Whether you use JavaScript.
Oh.
Well, especially when you're forcing people multi-meg downloads of JavaScript files on, front-end UI intensive applications these days. So.
Totally. I love it when my iPhone goes down to like 4 frames a second because it's fading in a lightbox.
Yep.
So here's a for-in loop to iterate over non-array objects. If you're using jQuery, you can also just use jQuery each. Right?
Yeah, and it determines that it's an object and it should iterate through in the same method that
Yeah.
he's using.
So this is more educational than super necessary. You've got a little bit on the hasOwnProperty call right here, which filters out a possibility of a clone function showing up. This is a situation, it's not really an anti-pattern. He says an anti-pattern here, and then the very next page says that it's probably not a big deal unless you are, depending on the task and confidence you have in the code. So if you're going in with this for-in loop and then you are afraid, or you're running into this clone function like you're walking through the whole thing, you either have to account for it or filter it out using hasOwnProperty. It seems like a lot of time devoted to something that he eventually says it's not an error. You can skip it and slightly speed up the loops. If you're not sure about the contents of the object, you're safer just adding it, or you could use jQuery each, and I think jQuery filters it out, because I don't remember ever running into this.
Yeah, I don't think it does anything with methods.
Yeah. So a formatting variation which doesn't pass JSLin, which is kind of a weird red flag, skips the curly brace and puts if on the same line. This definitely falls in the category of making your friends' heads explode, or your coworkers. You could do this. Someone is going to sigh heavily when they figure out what you're doing, but be cute at your own risk, I guess. Don't augment built-in prototypes. Usually isn't something that people are doing, but you shouldn't do that. He gives you the only when all of these conditions are met, not just 2 and not just 1, but all of these conditions. Basically, these conditions are pretty strict. I'm not going to get into them, but this really, at least in the work that we do, it doesn't. I don't know. Augmenting built-in prototypes isn't a necessity ever. He tells you how not to screw up switch statements. Another way to not screw up switch statements is to not use switch statements.
Yeah, we've recently switched to using.
Switch.
It's not. Oh, it's awful. You're very punny. Oh my goodness. Okay, so instead of using a switch statement, we throw methods on an object, and then use the array-like notation for the object, and the result of the switch is fed in as the method name, and then you call that method.
Which looks way cleaner. Oh, we have 4 minutes? Oh, goodness. All right.
Oh
no! Which looks way cleaner. I don't know if you guys out there caught that. Basically making an object and all the properties of the object are methods. And then you access them using the array notation to access the object. It looks nicer. You don't run into these situations where you forget to put a break and fall down to the next level and screw everything up, or forget to put a default and end up in an insane result. I like that he says to make sure there's always a sane result, implying that if you don't have a default, something insane might happen instead of nothing. Let's see, we're going to go through triple equals, like we talked about a little bit but when we started. He spends a long time. Since we're running out of time, we're not going to go too much on it. Don't use eval. He talks about why you shouldn't use eval. You also shouldn't pass strings to set interval, set timeout, and function constructor, because they all essentially just eval that code. And he provides some good examples as to how not do that. Always specify the radix parameter when you're using parsant, which you should be doing anyway.
yeah, and then he says not to use parsant there.
Okay, yeah, and then he says there are some alternatives to parsant that are faster, which are arguably make less sense unless you're used to seeing them.
Yeah, seeing positive string 08
Yeah.
is kind of
Parse,
squirrely.
Parsint is more readable. This again is one of those micro performance enhancements. Indent anything with curly braces, please. Put your opening curly brace on the same line. Don't put it on the new line.
Specifically because of return statements.
Yeah, because of the way return works. Return has an implied semicolon after it, no matter what. These are all like, if you're fighting these battles to put curly braces in a weird place,
But
that's
I
probably.
thought he said we should use C-like syntax.
If you're not Paul, you should try. Again, bigger fish to fry.
You can argue both sides of C-like syntax. It's a C-like.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I believe. I don't know. It's been a long time.
I would argue that this is more common in C as well,
Yeah.
from what I've seen.
Yes.
From what I've seen, like that one, Shane.
Awesome. So use whitespace. I just want to zoom in on this because I think it looks hilarious. Don't do that. Just put spaces in between your things. Don't be that guy.
Please make it more readable.
I'm going to suggest
terrible.
you save
Yeah.
some of this for next week because we're starting
Okay.
to get into some interesting stuff that
Okay.
I don't want to rush through.
All right. Well, we'll stop on page 27, and we'll come back next week. Join us next week for another edition of Flip Club with Hashrocket.
Are there any other book cut or questions in that?
Yes.
No.
Oh.
Well, I mean, I guess maybe the one remaining one was why was QUnit chosen over Jasmine? Was Jasmine evaluated?
I had heard good things about QUnit. Paul did a really good presentation on it up at JSCon, and that's why I tried it.
I think QUnit's quite a bit older too.
QUnit, I mean, if you're testing a jQuery plugin, QUnit is what they use to test jQuery itself.
And that's why we chose it.
There's nothing wrong with Jasmine. I mean, there's lots of different testing frameworks besides those two. So find something that works well for you and what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that, I mean, there are a lot of extra uses to QUnit that I didn't even feel the need to get into for what I was doing. It's really flexible.
Yeah, QUnit is, I mean, it's just straight up JavaScript. It's not plugged into Rails or anything. I don't know about Jasmine. I honestly haven't looked at it.
No, it's just straight up JavaScript.
Yeah, if all you need is make some tests and use some equals and same functions, and you can check pretty much anything. It's good for most cases. Anything else?
Nope, not that I've seen in there.
All right. Bye.